David through Nathan. The real question we ask is, did God want a temple? Did God ever ask for a temple? And the answer is no. At no time did God ever command a temple. He never asked for a temple. Basically, he's raising a rhetorical question. What makes you think, really the question is, what makes you think you're the man to build a temple? He said, did I ever ask anyone to build me a temple? They had all that succession of judges throughout they'd had Moses. Moses then had been succeeded by Joshua. Joshua had come into the land. They had taken the land. There had been a succession of judges. At no time in any of that history had God gone to any of those men and said, hey, build me a temple. And so here he is saying, what makes you think I want a temple? Did God approve of a construction of a temple for his worship? And the answer has to be an unqualified no. No, I didn't ask for a temple. We find that there were a number of problems with the temple, in fact. There were a number of problems with the Jews having a temple. If we read over in Jeremiah, for example, we read over in Jeremiah 7, starting in verse 4, it says, do you trust in deceptive words, saying, this is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord? For if you truly amend your ways and your deeds, if you truly practice justice between a man and his neighbor, if you do not oppress the alien, the orphan, or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood on this place, nor walk after other gods to your own ruin, then I will let you dwell in this place, in that land which I gave your fathers forever and ever. The temple then became that thing. They began to rely on the thing, you see. They began to come to worship the thing rather than God. They began to consider the temple in higher esteem than God, than the commands of God. This was God's point here in Jeremiah, is that you're focusing on the temple and you're thinking you're secure because you have the temple, and through that, then you have that security. No, you have security in being obedient to the commands of God, not in the fact that the temple is within this city. God, through Amos, predicted its destruction. Again, we turn over to the book of Amos. Amos, the 9th chapter, in verse 11, he says, on that day, I will raise up the fallen booth of David and wall up its branches. I will also raise up its ruins and rebuild it as in the days of old. He's referring there to that destruction of the temple, knowing that it was going to be destroyed. The Spirit of God, of course, ultimately led the temple. We could read over in Ezekiel 11, 22 and 23, where the glory of God leaves the temple. You realize that even in the day of Jesus, when they had the temple and they had the Holy of Holies, which was where the Ark of the Covenant was supposed to be, that space was empty. The Ark of the Covenant had disappeared centuries before, had been lost centuries before, and so it sat empty. Jesus, of course, ultimately referred to the temple as a den of thieves over in Matthew 21 and verse 13. So to suggest that God had wanted David to build a temple, that God directed David to build a temple, is not so. And one of the Bible commentators suggests, he says, the temple may have had a place in unifying national Israel, but it stood in the way of a more lofty and universal faith in God, who dwells with the humble and contrite and is in their midst when they are gathered together. God never wanted, a permanent temple like that. He was much more interested in having the children of Israel be obedient to his will, be subject to him in that way. And the construction of a temple was actually contrary to his design. Why did God then allow it to happen? Well, God apparently allowed it to happen because of his desire to support Israel, even though sometimes Israel was doing things they ought not do. And so God allowed them to go ahead with it, even though he was disapproving of it. If we read here in this chapter, verse 7, this is yet again another example that we have in the Bible where silence of the scriptures does not constitute authority. Because there God says, whenever I've gone up with one of the sons of Israel, whenever I have gone with all of the sons of Israel, did I speak a word with one of the tribes of Israel, which I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar? In other words, when did I ever say that I wanted a temple? When did I ever say I wanted a fancy house? And to suggest that, well, God, you didn't say you didn't want a fancy house. Clearly, it doesn't constitute authority. And so once again, we see an example where men take it upon themselves to enact something that they think is going to be pleasing to God. And God never, God is fully capable of telling us what he wants and fully capable of expressing his will. And for us to feel the need to insert ourselves into his affairs is being presumptuous. Yeah, where we're gonna look at that in just a minute. We're gonna look about what that means, because he says the same sort of thing here. In fact, let's go forward in that. Let's go forward with that. And verse 11, because verse 11 is kind of parallel to what you got there. He says there in verse 11, even from that day, or verse 12 rather. Some overlap, I guess. Verse 12. It says, when your days are complete and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your descendants after you, who will come forth from you, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will correct him by the rod of men and the strokes of the sons of men. But my loving kindness shall not depart from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever, and your throne shall be established forever. And according to all these words and all this vision, so Nathan spoke to David. Is he talking about Solomon here? And if we read over that verse that you suggested over in 1 Kings, what's that chapter again, Ruth? 1 Kings 5 and verse 5. Yeah, he said, I intend to build a house for the name of my, verse 5. Verse 4, but now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side. There's neither adversary nor misfortune. And behold, I intend to build a house for the name of the Lord my God, as the Lord spoke to David my father, saying, your son, whom I will set on your throne in your name, in your place, he will build a house in my name. Okay. Yes, Solomon, I fully believe Solomon recorded this, said this, made this statement. Was that prophecy, though, about Solomon? Solomon clearly thought it was. It's clear Solomon thought that prophecy was about him, but in reality, I don't believe it was. I don't believe that prophecy was about Solomon. Because for one thing, if we look at what the text says, he says, when your days are complete and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up a descendant. Well, Solomon was not raised up when David's days were complete. He was raised up rather during David's life. David was still alive, for one thing. Second of all, Solomon's throne was not established forever. His throne really didn't even survive into the days of his son. Oh, he kept his kingdom. He kept the kingdom over Judah. But if you recall, of course, it was in the days of his son Rehoboam that the northern and southern kingdom split. Jesus' throne, of course, is eternal. We read that in Hebrews 1 and verse 8. So Jesus' throne is eternal. And in verse 14, now a lot of folks will point to verse 14 going, oh, wait a minute, how can that refer to Jesus? He says, when he commits iniquity, I will correct him. Well, there's a little bit of a nuance to that translation. It says, when he commits iniquity, could be better translated as, even in his suffering for iniquity. He says, even in his suffering for iniquity, I'll correct him by the rod of men and the strokes of the sons of men, as is stated in Isaiah 53 and verse 5. We might ask ourselves, at what time was it ever that Solomon was corrected the rod of men and the strokes of the sons of men? We have no episode at all of Solomon being beaten. We have no episode at all of Solomon being punished in such a way. As though, so to suggest that this text here must be referring to Solomon is a stretch. It's got to be a stretch. And we might ask, which one of David's sons was treated in this way? And the answer, and also received a promise that your throne will be established forever. And the only answer we can come up with is Jesus Christ. It is Jesus Christ who received that promise that your throne is going to be established forever. Again, as pointed out in Hebrews 1 and verse 8. And so as we read this, yes, I fully agree with you, Ruth, that over in 1 Kings 5, Solomon is saying these things, believing that this prophecy refers to him. He believes that. And he goes ahead and he constructs the temple that his father David had wanted to build. David understands that he's not going to be the one to build it. Solomon goes ahead, but in the end, we find out that I believe, frankly, that this prophecy does not refer to Solomon at all. It refers to Jesus Christ. Indeed, if you remember what Jesus told the Pharisees, he said, if you destroy this temple, I'll raise it up again in 3 days. But, the text was clear. He referred to the temple of his body. That was the temple that was to be built. That was the temple that was constructed. And Jesus was the one who was going to be building that temple. David, however, may have in fact understood that this prophecy did not refer to Solomon, but rather to a later descendant. He writes of this promise if we look over into Psalm 89. We go into Psalm 89, starting in verse 30. He says, if his sons forsake my law, and if they do not walk in my judgments, if they violate my statutes, and do not keep my commandments, then I will visit their transgression with the rod, and their iniquity with stripes. But I will not break off my loving kindness from him, nor deal falsely in my faithfulness. My covenant I will not violate, nor will I alter the appearance of my lips. Once I have sworn in my holiness, I will not lie to David. His descendants shall endure forever, and his throne as the sun before me. It shall be established forever like the moon, and the witness of the sky is faithful. So here is David, who perhaps even in writing the psalm understood that this does not refer to Solomon, but rather to a later descendant that is to come from him. And indeed, that's what I believe this is being talked about here, that God is saying, I'm going to give you a descendant. That descendant will build a temple, that he will have a kingdom that will endure. But again, to say that it refers to Solomon, I think is something of a stretch. Why didn't he stop Solomon? I don't know why he didn't stop Solomon. That's a good question. Why didn't he stop them from rebuilding the temple when they came back after the captivity? And when we look at some of the Bible scholars who write about this, and they say that God allowed them for the cause of national unity or something like that. I don't know that I necessarily agree with that position. I think that he allowed it to allow them to establish a religion, a religious center that would continue to serve Him. But it was never God's intention to build a temple. Yeah, that's David talking to Solomon. Yeah. Yes. 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 Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 I don't know that we. I agree. I don't know that we know why God allowed it. I think you maybe have a point that God allowed things that were otherwise that were otherwise displeasing to Him, but He still allowed it. Like your example of divorce, I think is an excellent one. Yes, He allowed divorce. He was displeased by it, but He allowed it. And um, it may be that this was another example of that kind of behavior on the part of God. That yes, he did not ask for a temple. He did not necessarily want a temple, but he was willing to allow it for um, uh, for the because of maybe because of the nature of the Israelites or something like that. Yes. Yeah. We get into it almost becomes an element of human nature that we want to venerate a thing, and we even see it in our language. We talk about uh, you know we talk about here is the Notre Dame church. Okay, is that the church? Well, as John has been careful to point out, no, that's a building. That's a building. The church is the people. That's what the word church even means, is the assembly. And so, but we've worked that into our language where the building becomes the church. Um, I was thinking about this. In preparing this lesson. I was thinking about this that you know um, various religious groups have their various artifacts that they'll hang on to, and if we can imagine, suppose we did have um, the actual cross of Jesus Christ. It could be historically proven. This is the cross on which Jesus died, and somebody had that. Or what if we had this was here's the actual crown of thorns that was pressed into his head, and somebody actually had it. It could be historically proven. Or here is the original manuscript of Paul's letter to the Romans, and somebody had that, and it could be historically proven that this is that document. Uh, what would happen to us? What would happen? Would we not begin to venerate those things? Would we not become respectful for those things as items, and begin to consider them to be in some way holy or sacred or whatever, when in fact it is the will of God that is to be considered holy and sacred, and the fact that if we even had the original manuscript of Paul's letter to the Romans, for example, would that make it better than what we have in our own Bibles? And the answer ought to be no. It would not make it better. It would not make it any better than any of the other texts that we have. The fact is that we, again, would have that attitude about us that somehow we've even seen it in some of the thinking of folks who, when they go through the Bible, they want to read the red letters, being the actual words of Christ, and give them greater authority than they do some of the other writings. And yet Paul said that the writing that he did came from Jesus. The very ideas were given to him by Christ. And so to suggest that one set of writings is better than another, we start to again try to elevate certain parts, and it creates this kind of mental hierarchy for ourselves. And there is no evidence of that ever. Was God unhappy being in the tabernacle, the very tabernacle that he had designed, that he had given the instructions on how to build? No, there's no indication at all he was unhappy with that. He had given them that design and given them all the instructions on how to build it. And so now here they come along and no, wait a minute, that tabernacle isn't good enough, God. We're going to have to build a temple for you. Again, where did they get the idea that somehow what God had designed wasn't good enough? And we find ourselves doing that. Yeah, Justin? Right. Yeah, that's another good example. Yeah. Yeah, God never commanded them to have a king, and yet they were determined to have a king, and he allowed them. He allowed them to have a king. Daryl, go ahead. Yes, he did. He did tell them to rebuild. I think that was part of his. I think it was part of his indulgence of them. I think he was willing to indulge them in this act of reestablishing. This became a way of reestablishing the religion that he wanted them to have, and there was a way of reestablishing his goal of having that lineage down to Jesus. Um, but again, at no time did he ever require them to build to build him a temple. Yeah, Gary, go ahead. Yes. Yeah. Well, I think when he's talking about this is verse 16, whoever swears by the temple, that is nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obligated. You know, the real point there is that they were making distinctions in their in making their promises. Okay, and that such a distinction was not pleasing to God. He expected them to keep your key. You know, even Jesus said, you know, keep, you know, make your yay yay and your nay nay. Yeah. Well, and in their view, that would have been the case. It would have, you know, which is better, just you know, just a here's a bar of gold or a bar of gold that is offered at the temple. In their own minds, the temple would have made it. Uh, well, in their own mind, the gold of the temple was the important thing. So I still think that yeah, I still believe that yes, God allowed them to build the temple. God indulged them, if you will, but it was not part of his it was not part of his plan. It was not part of his intent that they would ever build a temple. Yes, he allowed them to go ahead and do so, but I don't think it was again his intention that they would do so. He said, I could have easily told somebody long before you, David, to have done this, and I never did. All right, we may come back to that though at some point, huh? Well, you gonna beat me up today? Come on, First Chronicles. It is all right. First Chronicles 22. What do you got, John? Okay. Okay. That's true. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Right. Hmm. Yeah, I know. Yeah. Um, still kind of hung up though on the here in 2 Samuel 7. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's what he says like in verse 7. When did I ever tell anybody to build me a house? Yeah, when did I ever tell anybody to build me a house? He does say that. And then, the other part that I have, yeah, yeah, he acquired a lot of the supplies for it. Yeah. All right. All right. Well, maybe I'll go back and re-examine this. Well, see, I'm still concerned about verse 14. When he commits iniquity, I'll correct him with the rod of men and the strokes of the sons of men. And yet I have never found an episode where Solomon was beaten for some of his iniquities, which he should have been. Well, yeah, they did rip it apart. All right, that's an interesting question. I'll have to look at that some more. Thank you. Yeah, thank you everyone for your thoughts on that. That's very, very interesting discussion. Yeah. Well, when Nathan talks to David, like you hear in verse 3, he says, Nathan said to the king, go and do all that is in your mind, for the Lord is with you. Okay. Well, I think Nathan is speaking generically because he knows that God is for David, is with David, and therefore, if David is determined to build this house, Nathan is, I believe, assuming that this sounds like a good thing to be done, and God is with you, so go ahead and do it. And he may have been speaking more as a friend to David than as a prophet of God, because obviously the follow up is that God has to, in effect, correct Nathan and say, wait a minute, I didn't tell anybody to build me a house. So that's Nathan becomes, in fact, Nathan becomes God's spokesman for a lot of episodes here, and I think that's right too. Anyway, David then responds to this prophecy. He's got this prophecy that about your kingdom, your house is going to be established, your kingdom will be established forever. And God responds to this prophecy, this encouragement on this regard from God. He responds to it with this rather beautiful prayer here starting in verse 18. So David the king went in and sat before the Lord, and he said, who am I, O Lord God, that in my house that thou hast brought me this far? And yet this was insignificant in thine eyes, O Lord God, for thou hast spoken also of the house of thy servant concerning the distant future, and this is the custom of the man, O Lord God. And again, what more can David say to thee? For thou knowest thy servant, O Lord God. For the sake of thy word, and according to thine own heart, thou hast done all this greatness to let thy servant know. For this reason thou art great, O Lord God, for there is none like thee, and there is no God beside thee, according to all that we have heard with our ears. And what one nation on the earth is like thy people, Israel, whom God went to redeem for himself as a people, and to make a name for himself, and to do a great thing for thee, and awesome things for thy land before thy people, whom thou hast redeemed for thyself from Egypt, from the nations and their gods. For thou hast established for thyself the people of Israel as thine own people forever, and thou, O Lord God, hast become their God. Now therefore, O Lord God, the word that thou hast spoken concerning thy servant and his house, confirm it forever as thou hast spoken. And that thy name may be magnified forever by saying, the Lord of hosts is God over Israel, and may the house of thy servant David be established before thee. For thou, O Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, hast made a revelation to thy servant, saying, I would build you a house. Therefore thy servant has found courage to pray this prayer to thee. And now, O Lord God, thou art God, and thy words are truth, and thou hast promised this good thing to thy servant. And now therefore may it please thee to bless the house of thy servant, that it may continue forever before thee. For thou, O Lord God, hast spoken, and with thy blessing may the house of thy servant be blessed forever. We see a number of things then in this prayer. The first part of it, verses 18 to 21, here is David. He's expressing his unworthiness. He knows that God has graciously given him so many good things. We ought to recognize this in ourselves as well. Yes, God gives us all sorts of good things. He's very merciful. He's very kind to us. And David also saw the kindness that God had done and was grateful to God for that. In verses 22 to 24, he praises God for what God has done in the past, pointing out even the history of Israel. And in verses 25 to 29, then he goes forward with a plea that God will fulfill this promise. We see that something in the humility of David. He refers to himself 10 times as God's servant, and 8 times he refers to God as his Lord. And so we see that humility. It's interesting, again, we see the contrast between David and Saul, that there is not that same, we never see that same degree of humility in Saul. We never saw that humility, that willingness to obey in Saul that we see in David. Before we get into this next point, I'm going to stop, actually. It's actually about 19 after, and really don't have time to develop it. So I'm going to stop there, and we'll continue. We'll wrap up this last section of chapter 7 and go on with the next chapters afterward. And it may come back to this idea about who's being referred to in this prophecy. I'm going to have to do some more study on that, I think. But that is an interesting discussion. Thanks for your attention and your participation this morning.